The family was coming, and there was no way I could escape. Not without my sister. Unwilling to die in my bed, I decided to wait for them in the office, just as I always had. The revolver rested neatly on my lap and the coffee pot brewed in the corner. I considered collecting the crystalline rocks beneath the room to fashion some sort of weapon, but I feared they would notice their absence and act before I could. I still had the one that ended that ravenous fiend in the caverns, but there was no way I could dispatch all of them in the same manner. Not like that. They were never alone. So I sat in the office plotting their demise and fighting the overwhelming urge to sleep. It was some time after midnight when they arrived. Despite the unlit vacancy sign in the empty parking lot, they pulled in as they always did, parking right outside their room. The middle-aged man was the first to exit the car, rushing to the door with a restrained urgency. The middle-aged woman followed behind. When they found it locked, both stood at the door. In unison, they turned towards the old man as he stepped out of the car. There he was, the park ranger from the photos, with the same haunting stare. The three exchanged knowing glances, then turned their attention to the office. To me. I gripped the revolver tight and watched as the old man opened the back door of the station wagon. When he stepped aside, a dark figure emerged. For a moment she appeared as a walking shadow, devoid of light. But the truth was more horrifying than that. The teenage girl, covered head to toe in fresh blood, stepped into the parking lot of my motel. On the other side of the car, the old woman emerged. The teenage girl stood facing my direction for what seemed like an eternity, waiting for something. I realized all of them were looking directly at me. The teenage girl moved first. She turned back to the car and reached inside. When she turned back to me, she was holding my sister. It was the way that she held her in her blood-soaked arms that I could tell this was a threat. The old man broke from the group and walked towards the office. Behind them all, they all stared. I took a deep breath and readied myself for what I had to do. As he approached, he glanced up at the old sign that hung above. "You're always welcome." He grabbed the knob and turned it, and when he opened the door, he smiled. It was the same fake smile I'd seen 100 times. He then removed his hat and entered. "Hello, we'd like to rent a room, please," he said. I sat there in disarmed shock. I was unsure of what to do next, but my instincts took over for me. "Okay," I said, surprising even myself. I turned to grab the key hanging behind my desk and once again got a glimpse of the teenage girl. Her eyes were still locked on me and my sister was still gripped tightly in her arms. "Here you go," I said, swallowing the lump in my throat. He took the key with a polite nod and walked casually out of the office. I watched him join the family and head directly to the room. With an unnerving sense of normalcy, he opened the door and entered. The rest followed in a straight line, except for the teenage girl. She put down my sister, who then ran into the unlit room behind the others. The teenage girl remained. She watched me through the window with an unnerving gaze. I only looked away for a moment, but it was long enough for her to disappear. Immediately, I reached for the phone. I had lied for too long and brought pain and despair to everyone around me. I pulled the sheriff's card from my pocket and dialed. He picked up after one ring. "Sheriff," I whispered. "Ah, you again. Did you happen to remember?" "They're here," I said, cutting him off. There was a moment of silence. "The motel?" he asked. "Yes, same room, they are." The line went dead. I dialed again, no answer. I gathered my thoughts and tried to work out a plan. I had to figure out a way to separate them from my sister. I needed to get her alone so that we could escape together, monster or not. She was still my only family. I'd only gotten as far in my plan as I need to get her alone when I heard the car approach. The red and blue lights flashed in the distance as the cruiser approached at a very high speed. However, the moment he hit the parking lot, he killed the lights and slowed to a crawl. I watched him park too close to the family station wagon. Then again, he was the only other vehicle in the parking lot. There was nowhere to hide. I went to the door, revolver in hand, and peered out through the window next to it. With one hand on the knob, I waited for him. Again, he stayed in his car for an uncomfortably long time, his sense of urgency seemingly lost. I then realised he was probably calling in support, but I thought wrong. Instead, he opened the door, and with a casual saunter, he made his way to the family's room. "No," I said in a hoarse whisper. I opened the door to warn him, but before I could get out a word, he knocked. He waited, then opened the door himself and went inside. Terrified, I wanted nothing more than to go back inside the office, but it was foolish to think anywhere was safe. I stepped outside with the gun in my hand and crept towards the room. I lingered back by the cars, listening for any sign of a struggle. Minutes later, that sign came in the form of 6 gunshots. They were followed by silence. I ran, but not in the direction I expected. I ran towards the room. 6 shots for 6 members of the family. Foolishly, I had hoped he'd missed the last one. "Stay where you are!" he yelled from inside the room. I pushed open the door and stumbled inside. What I found was not the heroic scene of a small-town lawman standing over slain demons, but instead he was lying in the corner of the room, bleeding profusely from the gut. As I stepped into the room, the family gently pushed me aside as they walked calmly out of the room. They paid no notice to the revolver dangling at my side. The old man tipped his hat and flashed that fake smile as he passed, as if this were nothing out of the ordinary. "Where are you going? You can't leave now!" the sheriff shouted through the blood pooling in his mouth. He fired the gun again, straight into his own stomach. "Now you have to turn me. You have to turn me now," he shouted, and with each word the exertion pushed oozing blood from his wounds. The older woman ignored him as she collected her earrings from the side table and walked out the door, followed by the teenage girl, now cleaned of blood and changed into a modest dress, neither acknowledging the dying man in the corner. "I covered up everything for you. You owe me this," he whimpered. And with that, the door shut behind them, leaving me standing in the cursed room with this dying man. Did you shoot yourself?" I asked. Frustrated, he waved the gun wildly as blood seeped from his nose, mouth, and multiple bullet holes. "It seemed like a good idea at the time," he choked, laughing through the pain. "I know they need me, but I guess I miscalculated how much." I looked down at this dying man and couldn't help but feel vindicated in my mistrust. "Be a doll and call an ambulance, would you?" he said, the colour draining from his face. I pulled out my phone. A look of momentary relief flashed across his face. I started to dial, but then stopped. "What do you mean, they need you?" I asked, my finger hovering over the send button. Frantic worry set in as he realised why I hesitated. "Oh, cut the shit. We both know what they are. You don't have to lie anymore. You help me find them. We both want the same thing, you and I." He sputtered. "I don't think so. What did you do for them?" I asked. He laughed in disbelief. "Really? Did you ever wonder what happened to the bodies once they were done with them? The ones they didn't leave on the side of the road for me to handle?" I shook my head. "It's your property. It's big, but not that big," he said, realizing that I didn't know. "Where?" I asked, thinking about all the off-limits places my father had restricted us from. Dangerous sinkholes, the old septic tank, the open caves. My parents would never, I said, knowing it was a lie. Your parents maybe, but the old couple that run this place did every damn thing they were asked, and look what it got them. Shook my head, tears welling in my eyes. It got them their little girl back, I said weakly. I stood over the dying man, my whole world coming down around me. I knew the answers, but I was still not ready for the truth. I looked out into the direction of where the bodies were hidden, as if looking through the wall itself, searching for them. The septic, he said, as if he could read my mind. But you don't want to see that. I realised how close to death he was and hit send on the phone. Don't bother, he said. Even if you drove, I'd only make it to Gillis Road. 911, what's your emergency? Said the voice on the other line. I tried to answer, but the words wouldn't come, stuck in my mouth with uncertainty. The sheriff shook his head. Sorry, misdial. My apologies. Have a nice night, I said and hung up. Do what you will with my body, but without me, they're gonna come looking. And when they do, those monsters will be long gone, and you will be left to clean up and take the blame. You should probably have a plan for that. But I didn't do anything. It was all them, I said, choking on my words. It's your property, sort of, he said, pausing as a thought slowly came to him. They don't care if you fear them. They are smarter than that. They only care that you fear death. I watched as the life slowly drained from his body. I wanted to hold his hand, to comfort him, but my own repulsion of what he had done overrode my empathy. As he faded away, he looked me in the eyes and muttered one last thing. I remember your parents. What a shame. You should never have been left here with them. His voice trailed as his eyes glazed over, and his heart finally stopped. I rolled him into an old sheet and dragged his body to the cruiser outside. With great effort, I was able to heave his corpse into the back seat. I drove it around to the back of the motel and then returned to clean up the trail of streaked blood that led from the room to the parking lot. I used buckets of warm water from the shower and scrubbed it clean with an old push broom. It was a poor job, but I didn't have time for perfection. I drove the cruiser along the strange path I had avoided my entire life. My father told me as a child that this place was unsafe, and as an adult he further emphasised the danger of it. This is where he took old rusted propane tanks that sat for so long the sulphur smell had faded into a deadly absence. This is where he disposed of waste that was unfit for the burn pit. This is where he said that if I ever wandered into, it would cause everlasting harm. At least he was telling the truth about that. When I reached the unrecognisable location that I'd avoided for years, I stopped the car. I retrieved the large flashlight from the trunk and continued on, looking for any sign of, well, death. I saw the rusted white paint of old propane tanks buried halfway beneath a layer of dirt and fallen leaves, and walked in that direction. The smell hit first, the putrid stench of decay that was so thick you could taste it. The ground beneath me seemed to soften as I neared the trench where an old septic tank once was. It was never used and removed some time after I was born. It was the remnants of the dream home my father always promised to build for my mother. Instead, they settled into their macabre routine and lived out their lives in the small cottage attached to the motel. I always thought that my sister's death was the reason the dream was abandoned, but it turns out they just found other uses for the plot. As my view crested over the ditch, my mind struggled to comprehend the amount of death that was discarded just a few feet in front of me. Bodies in various states of decay. Most of them were years or decades old, stacked without regard to their humanity. Rotted bodies sat atop sun-bleached bones resting on a thick layer of decayed flesh, and on top of it all, as poor Bill Henley. His body was almost unrecognizable. No longer the strong, imposing man that stood outside his truck. Now he was nothing more than a withered white corpse, drained of everything that gave him life. Small incisions covered his legs, arms, belly and neck. He was drained of blood and wiped clean. His eyes were now nothing more than deep, black sockets. I felt guilt for not warning him, but I realised I had a chance to make it right. I pulled the sheriff from the back seat and dragged his body to the pit and rolled him down. He landed just next to Bill. I collected the bloody sheet and carried them over to the nearby burn pit, the one my father rarely used. I lit a match and I tossed it onto the sheets. As I watched the flames consume and burn the bloody sheets, I laughed at the futility of burning evidence when I had a pit of dead bodies only a few feet away. What was I trying to hide? In the wake of that epiphany, I formulated a plan. I stomped out the burning sheets and smothered the fire. I would need those later. I returned to the cruise and siphoned most of the gas from the tank, spilling it into a bucket I found nearby. I soaked the sheets in any dry wood I could find, which wasn't much. I then manoeuvred the cruiser to the edge of the grave so the headlights would illuminate the rotting mound of death. As I walked across the corpses searching for fat-soaked clothing or anything that would burn, I could hear the old bones snap and crunch beneath my weight. I listened to the nauseating squish of rotted organs rupturing below. By the time I climbed out, the smell of death and gasoline were undistinguishable. It didn't matter though. I knew exactly how I was going to dispatch these horrible, soulless creatures. I knew exactly how I was going to kill these vampires that had haunted me my entire life, these beings that cursed my family's very existence. I was going to bring justice to these people. I was going to murder every last one of the family, except, of course, my sister.